The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. Ayoy learned this truth the way all Apache children learn it, through burned feet on hot sand and thirst that turns spit to dust. But she learned it again at 17, running barefoot across rocks that cut like broken glass with 3 riders closing the distance behind her. Her lungs burned. Each breath tasted of copper and fear. The gray uniform dress they'd forced her to wear for 7 years hung in tatters, now ripped by mesquite thorns and soaked through with sweat. Her black hair, cropped short to her jawline by Sister Judith's dull scissors, whipped across her face as she ran. Behind her, the voices of the student hunters grew louder. "Rebecca!" they shouted, using the name that wasn't hers. "Rebecca Whitfield, stop running!" She didn't stop. To her left, hidden in a cluster of red rocks, 2 children struggled to keep pace. Kaya, 9 years old, with eyes too large for her thin face, stumbled over her own feet. Tahoma, barely 7, moved in silence as he'd done for 3 years, ever since the teachers beat the words out of him. Ayoy had told them to stay hidden, told them she'd come back. But Kaya had opened the door of the isolation room anyway, had pressed a stolen key into Ayoy's hand, and whispered in Apache, the forbidden language, "You saved me from the closet. Now I save you." That was 6 hours ago, before the sun rose over St. Catherine's Indian Industrial School, before Reverend Canfield discovered 3 empty beds and rang the bell that meant runaways, before he sent his best students, the ones whose souls he'd already captured, to hunt down the ones who still remembered their names. The cliff rose ahead like a wall. Ayoy's eyes tracked upward, calculating. 30 feet of red sandstone pockmarked with handholds. She'd climbed worse as a child before the soldiers came, before they took her from the place where she'd been born and dragged her to the place where they tried to kill who she was. She glanced back. Kaya had fallen behind her, breathing ragged. Tahoma pulled at the girl's arm, trying to help. "Hide," Ayoy called to them in Apache, the word sharp and quick. "In the rocks. Don't move until I come back." Kaya's face crumpled, but she obeyed. The 2 children disappeared into a crack between 2 boulders, and Ayoy turned to face the cliff. Her fingers found the first handhold, then the second. She pulled herself up, ignoring the pain in her shoulders, ignoring the voice in her head that sounded like Sister Judith saying, "Savages climb, civilized people walk through doors." 10 feet up, she heard the horses arrive below. "She's climbing," one of the hunters shouted. "Get her down," another yelled. 15 feet, 20. Her right hand slipped on loose stone, and her body swung out over empty air. For one terrible moment she hung by 3 fingers on her left hand, scrabbling for purchase with her feet. Then she found another hold and kept climbing. "Shoot over her head." The voice belonged to Marcus, a Navajo boy 2 years older than her, who'd been at the school so long he'd forgotten how to speak anything but English. "Scare her down." The first gunshot cracked across the desert. Ayoy flinched, lost her grip, and fell. The world tumbled. Sky, rock, ground, sky again. She hit the slope 15 feet below the cliff face, and her left ankle folded beneath her with a sound like breaking wood. The pain came a second later, white and absolute. She tried to scream, but her lungs had no air left. She slid down the rocky slope, unable to stop herself, until she came to rest at the bottom in a cloud of red dust. Above her, Marcus and the 2 other hunters stood at the cliff's edge, looking down. One of them, a girl named Sarah, raised her rifle to aim at Ayoy's chest. "Don't move," Sarah called. "We're coming down to get you." Ayoy tried to stand. Her left leg wouldn't hold weight. Through the haze of pain she saw bone pressing against skin, a white gleam beneath brown flesh. Broken. Badly broken. She was going to die here. Or worse, they'd drag her back to the school, back to the isolation room, back to Reverend Canfield's office, where he'd look at her with those cold blue eyes and say, "I'm disappointed, Rebecca. I thought you understood. We're saving you." She closed her eyes. Then a different gunshot rang out. This one came from somewhere to her right, from the desert floor, and it hit the rock face 2 inches from Marcus's head. The hunters scattered, scrambling back from the edge. Ayoy opened her eyes and turned her head, though the movement sent fresh waves of pain through her ankle. A man stood 50 yards away, half hidden behind a dead juniper tree. He was white tall, wearing clothes the same dusty brown as the desert. He held a rifle, but he wasn't aiming it at Ayoy. "Get out of here," The man called to the hunters above. His voice carried across the stillness rough as gravel. "This doesn't concern you." "That girl is property of St. Catherine's School," Marcus shouted back. "We have legal authority to retrieve her." "You have nothing," the man said. "Now leave before I put the next shot somewhere you'll remember it." There was a long silence. Then the sound of horses moving away fast. Ayoy watched the man lower his rifle and walk toward her. He moved with a limp favoring his left side. When he got close enough for her to see his face properly, she noticed three things. His eyes were gray like winter sky. His hands shook slightly even when he wasn't moving, and he had a scar running from his right shoulder down across his chest, visible where his shirt hung open at the collar. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at her broken ankle. "That needs splinting," he said. "Don't touch me," Ayoy managed. Her voice came out as a whisper. "Wasn't planning to." He set the rifle down out of her reach but not out of his own and pulled a canteen from his belt. He tossed it to her. The throw was gentle, calculated so it would land within reach without hitting her. Ayoy grabbed the canteen and drank. The water tasted of metal and dust, and it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever felt. "There's 2 kids hiding in those rocks over there," the man said, not looking at the rocks, not pointing, just stating a fact. "They yours." Ayoy stopped drinking. "They're children. They're not anyone's." Something that might have been approval flickered across the man's face. "Fair enough." He glanced up at the cliff where the hunters had disappeared, then back at Ayoy. "Those boys will be back, probably with more, and I don't shoot people if I can help it, which means we need to move." "I can't walk." "I noticed." He walked back to where he'd left his horse, a dusty mare with patient eyes tied to a creosote bush. When he returned, he was carrying rope and 2 straight pieces of wood, part of an old fence post by the look of them. He knelt beside her, still maintaining that careful distance, and started wrapping the splint. "This is going to hurt," he said. It did. Ayoy bit through her lip to keep from screaming and tasted blood. The man worked quickly, efficiently, without unnecessary movement. His hands didn't shake when he was focused on a task. When he finished, he stood up. "Can you ride?" "I can do whatever I have to do." He almost smiled at that. Almost. Instead, he walked over to the rocks where Kaya and Tahoma were hiding. "You can come out now," he said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you. But we need to leave." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Kaya's face appeared streaked with tears and dust. Tahoma emerged beside her, silent as always, his hand gripping Kaya's dress. The man looked at them, and something in his expression changed, closed down, like a door shutting. "How old are you?" he asked Kaya. "9," she whispered in English. "And him?" "7." The man was quiet for 10 full seconds. Then he said, "I have 1 horse, 1 cabin, 1 bed. You understand what that means?" "It means we'll sleep on the floor," Ayoy said from where she lay. "It means we'll work. It means we won't be trouble. And it means when you tell us to leave, we'll leave." The man looked at her for a long time. "What's your name? Your real one?" She hadn't heard that question in 7 years. "Ayoy." "What's it mean?" "Beautiful." He nodded once as if something had been settled. "Isaac Mercer," he said. "Let's go before those boys find their courage." He lifted Ayoy onto the horse with surprising gentleness, then helped the 2 children up behind her. The mare shifted, but held steady under the weight. Isaac took the reins and started walking, leading the horse north toward the mountains. Ayoy looked back once at the cliff where she'd fallen, at the rocks where she'd hidden, at the desert that had almost killed her. Then she looked forward at the broad back of the man who'd saved her for reasons she didn't understand, and wondered what kind of debt she'd just accepted. The walk to Isaac's cabin took 2 hours. He moved at a steady pace, not talking, not looking back to check on them, just walking. The 2 children fell asleep against Ayoy's back, exhausted from fear and sun. She stayed awake, studying the man below her. He was probably 35, maybe older, hard to tell with white men. They aged differently under the Arizona sun, their skin burning and peeling until they looked weathered as driftwood. He wore no hat, which was strange. His hair was brown long enough to touch his collar, shot through with gray at the temples. The scar she'd noticed earlier continued down his right side, disappearing beneath his shirt. A war wound, probably. Most white men his age had fought in something. But it was his hands that interested her most. They shook when he wasn't using them, a fine tremor like leaves in wind. But when he'd splinted her ankle, they'd been steady as stone. A man with two sets of hands. One for violence, one for everything else. The sun was directly overhead when they crested a small rise, and she saw the cabin. It sat in a shallow valley sheltered by red rock cliffs on three sides, a single-room structure built from pine logs that had weathered to silver gray. No porch, no decoration, just walls, a roof, and a door. A dead man's house, she thought. The kind of place where someone goes to wait for the end. Isaac led the horse to a small corral beside the cabin where a water trough sat in the shade. He helped Ayoy down first, supporting her weight without asking permission, then lifted the children down one at a time. "Water's from a spring behind the house," he said, pointing. "Outhouse is over there. Food inside. Not much, but it's there." "Where will you sleep?" Ayoy asked. "On the porch." "There is no porch." "Then on the ground." He said it like it didn't matter, and maybe it didn't. "Go inside. Stay quiet. Don't touch the box on the shelf." Ayoy turned to look at him. "What box?" "The one I just told you not to touch." He gathered the horse's reins. "I'm going to hide this mare. If those boys tracked us, I don't want them seeing her." He walked away toward a stand of cottonwoods, leaving the three of them standing in front of the cabin. Kaya looked up at Ayoy with frightened eyes. "Is he going to hurt us?" "I don't think so." "Then why did he help us?" That was the question. Wasn't it? Ayoy looked at the cabin, at its closed door and small window, and the absolute stillness of the place. "I don't know yet." She pushed the door open. The inside of the cabin was exactly what she'd expected. One room maybe 12 feet by 12. A narrow bed against the far wall covered with a gray wool blanket. A table with two chairs. A wood stove cold. A shelf with a few tin cups. A coffee pot, some dried meat hanging from the rafters. And on a small shelf near the window, a wooden box. It was perhaps 6 inches long, carved from dark wood with a small brass lock on the front. Someone had burned letters into the lid, H.M. 1880. Ayoy stared at it. The box seemed to stare back. Tahoma tugged at her dress and pointed to his mouth. "Hungry." She found the dried meat and some hardtack in a tin. She divided it between the children, giving them the larger portions, taking only enough for herself to quiet the worst of the hunger. They ate in silence, too tired to talk, too scared to ask questions. When Isaac returned an hour later, he found all three of them asleep on the floor, curled together like puppies. He stood in the doorway for a long time looking at them. Then he closed the door softly and walked away. That night, Ayoy woke to the sound of someone choking. She lay still, listening. The sound came from outside, harsh and desperate. She recognized it. She'd heard men make that sound before in the school, when the older boys had nightmares about whatever had happened to them before they came to St. Catherine's. Carefully, so as not to wake the children, she crawled to the window and looked out. Isaac sat on the ground 20 feet from the cabin, his back against a large rock. His head was in his hands. His shoulders shook. In the moonlight she could see his face, and the expression on it was something beyond grief. It was the look of a man drowning on dry land. She watched him for 5 minutes. 10. He didn't stop. Finally he stood up, walked a few steps away, and vomited. When he came back to the rock, he was steadier. He pulled out a small flask, took a long drink, then put it away. His hands stopped shaking. The mask came back down over his face. Ayoy moved away from the window. She lay down next to Kaya and Tahoma, her broken ankle throbbing, her mind racing. She'd escaped one kind of prison, only to find herself in another kind of mystery. A white man who saved Apache children but wouldn't sleep in his own house. A man with nightmares and steady hands, and a box marked with someone else's initials, a man who was dangerous in ways she didn't understand yet. But for tonight, they were out of the sun and away from the school, and the children were safe. That would have to be enough. Outside, Isaac sat against his rock and watched the stars until dawn came to take them away. 3 days passed in careful silence. Isaac established rules without speaking them. The children could use the cabin during the day. At night they slept on the floor while he stayed outside. They could drink from the spring and eat the food he provided, but they didn't go into the cottonwood grove where he'd hidden the horse. They didn't ask questions. They didn't touch the box. Ayoi's ankle began to heal. Not well, not quickly, but enough that she could put weight on it for short periods. Isaac had done good work with the splint. Better than good. He'd set broken bones before that much was clear. On the morning of the 4th day, he came into the cabin while they were eating breakfast. He stood in the doorway backlit by the rising sun and said, "Someone's coming." Ayoi was on her feet immediately, grabbing Kaya and Tahoma. "The hunters?" "No. Horse is walking too slow, steady pace. Either someone who knows this trail or someone who doesn't care about being heard." He looked at Ayoi. "There's a root cellar. Entrance is under the bed. Take the kids and get in it. Don't make a sound." "What are you going to do?" "Talk." He picked up his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. "Or not talk. Depends on what they want." Ayoi pulled back the bed. Sure enough, there was a trap door cut into the floor edges so neat they were almost invisible. She lifted it and found stairs descending into darkness. "Go," Isaac said. She went. The cellar was small, maybe 6 feet by 8, with a dirt floor and stone walls. It smelled of earth and old potatoes. Light came through gaps in the floorboards above enough to see by once her eyes adjusted. She could hear footsteps overhead as Isaac walked to the door. Kaya pressed against her side, trembling. Tahoma made no sound at all, as always. The door opened. Bootsteps on the threshold. "Deputy Fairchild," Isaac's voice flat and unwelcoming. "Mr. Mercer." A different voice, younger, with the careful neutrality of someone used to dealing with difficult people. "We're looking for 3 runaways from St. Catherine's. 2 girls and a boy. You seen anyone matching that description?" "No." "You sure about that? They were tracked heading this direction?" "Lots of directions from where they started. Desert's big." There was a pause, then the sound of more footsteps, someone else entering the cabin without permission. "Mr. Mercer," the deputy said, his voice tighter now. "I need to look around. You need a warrant for that. I have legal authority under the Indian Schools Act to search premises where fugitive students may be hiding." "That right?" Isaac's voice didn't change, but Ayoi heard something underneath it now, steel wrapped in cotton. "Show me the document." The sound of papers rustling. Then Isaac again. "This says you can search the school grounds and immediate vicinity. My cabin is 12 miles from St. Catherine's. That ain't immediate." "The Reverend says otherwise." "The Reverend," Isaac said slowly, "can say whatever he wants. Doesn't make it law." Another pause. Longer this time. Ayoi held her breath. Below her in the darkness of the cellar she saw something she hadn't noticed before. A shelf built into the stone wall. On it were items that didn't belong to a white homesteader. A leather pouch decorated with beadwork, a small flute carved from bone, a pair of child's moccasins so small they could only have fit a toddler. Apache belongings, old ones from the look of them. "Mr. Mercer," the deputy said, and now his voice had hardened. "Are you refusing to cooperate with a legal investigation?" "I'm telling you that you don't have authority to search my property. That's not refusing. That's educating. I can come back with a warrant." "Then do that." Footsteps. Someone walking across the cabin floor, getting close to the bed. Ayoi pulled the children tighter against her, feeling Kaya's heart beating like a trapped bird. "Deputy," Isaac's voice cut across the space, "you take one more step toward that bed, and we're going to have a problem." The footsteps stopped. "You threatening an officer of the law?" "I'm protecting my property from trespass. There's a difference." The silence stretched so long that Ayoi thought it would break. Then the deputy spoke again, but not to Isaac. "Check outside, Walker. See if there are any tracks." More footsteps. Someone leaving the cabin. "You know," the deputy said, his voice conversational now. "Reverend Canfield is a well-respected man in this territory. He's got friends in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, friends in the territorial government. You make trouble for him, you're making trouble for yourself." "I'll risk it." "That right?" The deputy's tone shifted. "You got family, Mr. Mercer? Anyone who depends on you?" "No." "Funny. I heard you had a son once." The silence that followed was different from the others. This one had weight. This one pressed down from above, making the air thick. When Isaac spoke again, his voice had gone completely flat. "Empty. Get out of my house." "Now, Mr. Mercer, I didn't mean to. I said get out." There was a very long pause. Then the sound of boots retreating the door, closing, horses moving away at a steady walk. Ayoy waited, counted to 100, then 200. Finally the trapdoor above her lifted, and Isaac's face appeared shadowed against the morning light. "They're gone," he said. "You can come up." She climbed out, helping the children up behind her. When they were all standing in the cabin again, she turned to face Isaac. He was putting his rifle back on the wall, moving with careful precision, as if the act of placing the weapon required his full attention. "Thank you," Ayoy said. "Don't." He didn't turn around. "Don't thank me for doing what any decent person should do. Most decent people don't." He didn't answer that. Instead, he walked to the door and stood looking out at the desert. "They'll be back. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. But they'll come back with more. That Deputy Fairchild, he's not a bad man. Just follows orders. But there are men who work with him who are different. Men who don't need orders to be cruel." "Then we'll leave." "And go where—" Isaac turned to look at her now. "You can barely walk. Those children are 7 and 9 years old. You'll die in the desert, or they'll catch you, or both. So what do you suggest?" Isaac was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There's a woman lives 5 miles west of here, Mabel Thornton. She's old, probably 70, and mean as a snake when she wants to be. She also hates Reverend Canfield with a passion I've never seen in a Christian woman. Why, that's her business." He grabbed his hat from a peg by the door. "I'm going to ride over there and talk to her, see if she can help. You stay here. Don't go outside. Don't light the stove during the day where smoke can be seen." "Why are you doing this?" Ayoy asked. Isaac stopped at the threshold. He stood there for a moment, his back to her, his hand on the doorframe. "I don't know," he said quietly. Then he left. The ride to Mabel Thornton's took Isaac an hour. He knew the way by heart, now had ridden it perhaps 50 times in the 5 years since he'd built his cabin. Mabel was the only neighbor within reasonable distance, and she'd taken it upon herself to check on him regularly after she found him passed out drunk in his own yard during his first winter. She'd dragged him inside, sobered him up, and told him in very clear terms that if he was going to kill himself, he could at least have the decency to do it somewhere other than her watershed. They'd been uneasy friends ever since. Her house was larger than his cabin, a proper homestead with a barn and a chicken coop and a vegetable garden that somehow survived despite the desert wanting it dead. She was outside when he arrived, hanging laundry on a line, her white hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Isaac Mercer," she called when she saw him. "You look like death warmed over. Get down here and tell me why." He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence rail. "I need your help." "That's a first." She pegged a sheet to the line with practiced efficiency. "What kind of help?" "The kind that could get you in trouble." Mabel turned to look at him fully now. Her eyes were sharp as broken glass despite her age. "I'm 72 years old. I've been in trouble before. Speak plain." So he did. He told her about finding Ayoy at the cliff, about the children, about Deputy Fairchild's visit. He told her everything except why he'd helped them in the first place, because he didn't have an answer to that question himself. When he finished, Mabel was quiet for a long time. She finished hanging the last of her laundry, then walked over to a bench under the shade of her porch and sat down heavily. "You know what you're asking me to do?" she said. "Yes." "You know that helping runaways from an Indian school is a federal offense?" "Yes." And you know that Reverend Canfield has enough influence to make both our lives considerably more difficult than they already are." "Yes." Mabel folded her hands in her lap. "That girl, the older one. What did you say her name was? Ayoi? What's it mean?" "Beautiful." Mabel nodded slowly. "I saw her at the school 3 weeks ago. She was tied to a post in the yard. They'd left her there for 2 days because she'd been caught teaching the younger children their own language." She looked up at Isaac. "I gave her water through the fence at night. She didn't say anything, just drank and looked at me like she was memorizing my face." Isaac felt something cold settle in his chest. "I didn't know that. Why would you don't go into town, you don't talk to people, you sit in that cabin of yours and wait for the past to finish killing you." Her voice was sharp, but not unkind. "Now you're telling me that same girl is in your house with 2 other children, and you need my help to keep them safe from men with badges and God on their side." "Yes." "Why did you save her, Isaac?" There it was, the question he'd been avoiding. He looked out at the desert, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the hard blue sky that never changed. "I don't know," he said finally. "When I saw those boys about to shoot her, something in me just moved, like I didn't decide. Like my body decided for me." "Your body remembers what your head wants to forget," Mabel said. "That's how guilt works." Isaac flinched. Mabel stood up, her knees creaking. "I'll help you, but on 2 conditions. First, you tell that girl the truth about who you are and what you've done. She's got a right to know. And second, you stop drinking." She looked at him steadily. "I can smell the whiskey on you from here. If we're going to protect those children, I need you sharp, not drowning." Isaac took a sharp breath and looked away. "I can't," he said quietly. "Can't stop drinking or can't tell her the truth. Both." Mabel walked over to him and put one weathered hand on his shoulder. "Isaac Mercer, I've known you for 5 years. I watched you build that cabin with your bare hands. I watched you survive winters that would have killed weaker men. I know what you did during the war. I know what it did to you, and I know you're not the man you were then." "How do you know that?" "Because that man wouldn't have saved 3 Apache children. He would have ridden past and told himself it wasn't his problem." She squeezed his shoulder. "The man you are now did something different. That means something." Isaac couldn't speak. His throat had closed up. "Go home," Mabel said. "I'll come by tomorrow with documents. I know a clerk in the land office who owes me a favor. We'll get those children papers that say they belong to you legally. Guardian papers. It won't stop Canfield, but it'll slow him down long enough for us to figure out what to do next." "What made you decide to help?" Mabel smiled, and there was no humor in it. "Because when I was 15 years old, I got pregnant by a boy my father didn't approve of. They sent me to a place in Ireland called a Magdalen Laundry. You know what that is?" Isaac shook his head. "It's a prison for girls who sin, or girls whose fathers think they've sinned. I spent 3 years there. They took my baby the day he was born and told me he'd died. I found out 30 years later they'd sold him to a rich family in Boston." She looked at Isaac with eyes that had seen too much. "I know what it's like to be someone's property. I know what it's like when the people who are supposed to protect you decide you need to be saved from yourself. So yes, I'll help, because if I don't, I'm no better than the nuns who took my son." Isaac didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. "Go on now," Mabel said. "Those children are probably scared. And that girl Ayoi, she's smart. She's going to figure out you're hiding something. You better decide what you're going to tell her when she asks." Isaac rode back to his cabin in silence, turning Mabel's words over in his mind. Tell her the truth. Stop drinking. Act like the man he wanted to be instead of the man he'd been. Simple enough. Impossible enough. When he got back, he found Ayoi standing outside the cabin despite his instructions. She was leaning against the wall, taking the weight off her bad ankle, but she'd clearly been waiting for him. "The children are asleep," she said. "I need to talk to you." "About what?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I went into your cellar. I saw the things you keep down there." Isaac's stomach dropped. "Apache things," she continued. "Old things. A flute. Moccasins for a baby, beadwork. She paused. Where did you get them? He could lie. Should lie. But Mabel's words echoed in his head. She's got a right to know. From people I killed, Isaac said. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Ayoi's face didn't change. During the war, after, I was Army, stationed at Fort Apache from 1878 to 1882. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant, like he was talking about someone else. We hunted warriors, that's what they called it, hunting, like it was sport. And these items, you took them from bodies. Some. The flute, I found it on a boy, maybe 16 years old. He was carrying it when we ambushed his group. He died singing. Ayoi closed her eyes. The moccasins were different, Isaac continued. He couldn't stop now. The words were coming out like poison from a wound. There was a family trying to cross into Mexico. We caught them at a ravine. There was a woman with a baby. She begged us to let them go. My captain said no, said orders were orders. No crossings. What happened to them? What always happened? Isaac stared at the ground, unable to meet her eyes. I kept the moccasins because I couldn't forget the sound that baby made. Not crying, not after, just silent. Ayoi opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Why do you keep them, these things you took? Because if I threw them away, I could pretend it never happened, and I don't deserve to pretend. They stood in silence for a long time. The desert wind moved between them, carrying the smell of sage and dust and the distant promise of rain that would never come. Finally, Ayoi spoke. Did you kill anyone named Hastiin? Isaac felt the bottom drop out of his world. I don't know. We didn't always know names. He was 16. He made flutes. He sang when he died. Isaac's legs stopped working. He sat down hard on the ground. He was my brother, Ayoi said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were fists. They came for our family in 1880. Soldiers, blue coats. They said we were trespassing on white land, but it was our land. It had been our land for generations. My brother tried to talk to them, tried to explain. They shot him while he was singing. Isaac couldn't breathe. Was it you? She asked. Did you shoot him? I don't know. The words came out broken. We ambushed 8 people that day. In June. I shot a boy with a flute, but I never saw his face clearly, never knew his name. He looked up at her. It might have been me, or it might have been any of the other 20 soldiers. Does the difference matter? No. Ayoi nodded slowly. She stood there for another long moment looking down at him, and Isaac waited for her to pick up a rock and bash his skull in. He wouldn't stop her. Couldn't stop her. Instead, she said, I should kill you. Yes. I could take your rifle while you sleep, or put a knife in your back. You've saved me, saved the children, but none of that changes what you did. No. But, she said, and now her voice cracked just slightly, if I kill you, what happens to Kaya and Tahoma, who protects them, who keeps them safe when Canfield sends more men? Isaac had no answer. So I'm going to make you a deal, Ayoi said. You help me keep those children alive and free, and I won't kill you. Yet. When they're safe, when they have somewhere to go that isn't a school or a grave, then I'll decide what you deserve. She turned and walked back into the cabin, limping on her bad ankle, leaving Isaac sitting in the dust, with the truth of what he'd done spreading out around him like blood in water. That night, while the children slept, Ayoi went back down into the cellar. She found the flute among the other items, lifted it carefully, and brought it up into the lamplight. The carving was unmistakable. Her brother's work. She'd know it anywhere, the careful attention to detail, the way he shaped the finger holes so they'd play true. She held it to her lips and blew softly. The note that came out was clear and pure and heartbreaking. Outside, Isaac heard it. He sat with his back against the cabin wall, tears running down his face, and listened to the ghost of a boy he'd killed 17 years ago singing one more song through his sister's breath. The desert wind carried the music away into the darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, the past refused to stay buried. Morning came without mercy the way it always did in the desert. Ayoy woke to find Isaac already gone, and breakfast laid out on the table, hardtack dried meat and water in 3 tin cups. He'd portioned it carefully, giving the children more than he gave himself. She studied the arrangement and felt something complicated twist in her chest. This man who'd killed her brother was now measuring food to keep her alive. This man whose hands had held a rifle aimed at Apache families was now the only thing standing between her and Reverend Canfield's righteous certainty. The world made no sense, or it made perfect sense in the worst possible way. Kaya stirred on the floor beside her, eyes opening slowly. Is he gone? For now. Are we safe? Ayoy looked at the child's thin face, at the fear that lived behind those large brown eyes, and told the only lie that mattered. Yes, we're safe. Tahoma sat up silently as always. The boy hadn't spoken a word since the day Sister Judith had locked him in a closet for 8 hours after catching him humming an Apache melody. When they'd finally opened the door, he'd walked out with empty eyes and a voice that had retreated so far inside him that it might never come back. They ate in silence, rationing the food the way children learn to when hunger is always close. Ayoy watched them and thought about the deal she'd made with Isaac. Keep the children alive, keep them free, then decide what justice looked like. Simple enough, impossible enough. She was helping Tahoma with his water when the sound of hooves cut through the morning quiet. Multiple horses, moving fast. Ayoy grabbed both children and pulled them toward the cellar. Her ankles screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She had the trapdoor open in seconds, was pushing Kaya and Tahoma down the stairs when the cabin door burst inward. Deputy Fairchild stood in the doorway, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were 4 other men, all armed, all looking at Ayoy with the kind of certainty that came from being on the right side of the law. Rebecca Whitfield, Fairchild said, using the name that wasn't hers. By authority of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Schools Act of 1875, you and the children with you are ordered to return to St. Catherine's Industrial School immediately. Ayoy didn't move. Couldn't move. Her body had gone still the way prey goes still when the predator is close enough to smell. Where are the other 2? Fairchild asked, looking around the cabin. Ayoy said nothing. One of the other men, a heavy-set fellow with a badge that said Town Marshal, stepped forward. Deputy asked you a question, girl. My name is Ayoy. The marshal's face darkened. Your name is what the school says it is. Now tell us where those children are, or this is going to get difficult. Through the gaps in the floorboards under her feet, Ayoy could feel Kaya's trembling, could sense Tahoma's absolute stillness, the way he'd learned to become invisible in the isolation rooms. They're not here, she said. That's a lie. The marshal walked toward the bed. Walker, check under there. The man called Walker, young and nervous-looking, moved toward the bed. He was reaching for the edge of the blanket when a gunshot split the air. Everyone froze. Isaac stood in the doorway, rifle raised, smoke curling from the barrel. The bullet had gone into the floor 6 inches from Walker's boot. Step away from the bed, Isaac said. His voice was calm, dead calm, the kind of calm that came before violence. Mr. Mercer. Fairchild held up his hands slowly. We have legal authority here. You have papers that say you can search school property and immediate grounds. This is private land 12 miles from that school, and unless you've got a warrant signed by a federal judge, you're trespassing. The Reverend said, I don't care what the Reverend said. The Reverend doesn't write law. Now get out of my house. The marshal turned to face Isaac, his hand moving toward his pistol. You threatening lawmen, Mercer? I'm defending my property from unlawful intrusion. Big difference. Isaac's rifle hadn't moved. You want to find out what happens next, go ahead and reach for that gun. The tension in the room stretched thin as wire. Ayoy watched Isaac's face and saw something she hadn't seen before. No fear, no hesitation, just a man who'd made a decision and would see it through to whatever end came next. Deputy, the marshal said, not taking his eyes off Isaac. "We need to handle this proper." "I agree." Fairchild was sweating now. "Mr. Mercer, we don't want trouble, but those children are legally wards of the government. We have an obligation." "Those children," Isaac interrupted, "are in my care, legal care. I filed guardianship papers 3 days ago with the territorial office. They're being processed right now." That was a lie. Ayoy knew it was a lie. Mabel hadn't even come yet with the forged documents. But Isaac said it with such flat certainty that even she almost believed him. Fairchild's eyes narrowed. "You filed guardianship papers for 3 Apache children you don't know. I know them well enough. Their parents are dead. They have no other family. I'm giving them a home. That's legal under territorial law." "Those papers won't be valid until approved by a federal judge," the marshal said. "Until then, the school has custody." "Then I guess we'll let a judge decide." Isaac lowered his rifle slightly, just enough to seem like he was de-escalating while keeping it ready to fire. "You want to drag this through court, that's fine, but you're not taking anyone from this property without a warrant. That's the law you're supposed to be upholding." The marshal looked at Fairchild. Fairchild looked at the other men. Some silent calculation was happening, weighing the cost of pushing this against the cost of backing down. Finally, Fairchild spoke. "We'll be back with a warrant. And when we come back, Mr. Mercer, you better have those papers you claim to have filed. Because if you're lying, you'll be arrested for obstruction and harboring fugitives." "I'll be here." The men filed out slowly, keeping their eyes on Isaac's hands near their weapons, but not touching them. Walker was the last to leave, casting one more look at the bed before following the others. Isaac waited until he heard the horses move away before lowering his rifle completely. He set it against the wall and walked to the bed, kneeling beside it. "You can come out now," he said quietly. The trapdoor lifted, and 2 small faces appeared, white with fear. Isaac helped them up, his movements gentle despite his size, then stepped back to give them space. Kaya ran to Ayoy and buried her face in the older girl's dress. Tahoma stood perfectly still, staring at Isaac with dark, unreadable eyes. "They'll be back," Isaac said, not to the children but to Ayoy. "Probably tomorrow, maybe tonight if Canfield pushes them hard enough." "What do we do?" "We run." Ayoy blinked. "Run where?" "Mexico. It's 40 miles south. If we leave now, travel at night, stay off the main trails, we might make it before they catch up." "I can barely walk. The children are exhausted. We won't make 40 miles. "Then we won't all make it." Isaac's face was stone. "But maybe you will. Maybe the kids will. That's better than staying here and waiting for them to come with enough men that I can't stop them." Ayoy stared at him. "You'd stay behind alone." "Someone has to slow them down. I'm the logical choice." "That's not a choice. That's suicide." Isaac shrugged. "I've been walking toward death for 17 years. This way at least means something." Before Ayoy could respond, the sound of another horse approaching cut through the tension. But this time it was alone, moving at a steady walk, and when Ayoy looked out the window, she saw an old woman on a mule. Mabel Thornton had arrived. She dismounted with the stiff movements of someone whose bones didn't bend the way they used to, tied her mule to the fence post, and walked into the cabin without knocking. "Isaac Mercer," she said, surveying the room with sharp eyes. "You look like you've been through hell." "Close enough." Mabel turned her attention to Ayoy and the children. "So these are the ones causing all the trouble." She walked closer, studying Ayoy's face. "I remember you, the girl at the fence. You drank the water I gave you like it was the last water on earth." Ayoy nodded slowly. "You risked yourself to help me." "Small risk. I'm too old for them to care about punishing." Mabel pulled a leather satchel from her shoulder and set it on the table. "But I'm not too old to forge documents. Got 3 sets of papers here that say these children are legally under Isaac's guardianship. Names, birth dates, parent information, all properly signed and sealed." Isaac picked up the documents and examined them. "These are good. Really good." "They should be. Cost me 2 bottles of whiskey and a promise to the clerk that I wouldn't mention where his wife was last Tuesday afternoon." Mabel sat down heavily in one of the chairs. But they're not going to stop Canfield. He's got connections that go higher than territorial clerks. You need something bigger. Like what? Like evidence that he's breaking the law himself. Evidence that would make the Bureau of Indian Affairs investigate him instead of helping him. Mabel looked at Ayoy. You said children have died at that school. How many? 7 that I know of, maybe more before I arrived. How did they die? Ayoy's jaw tightened. Starvation, disease, beatings. One girl fell downstairs after Sister Judith pushed her. They said it was an accident. Were they buried properly? Behind the school, in unmarked graves. Canfield said it was too expensive to send the bodies home. Mabel and Isaac exchanged a long look. That's federal money being misused, Mabel said. The Bureau pays for proper burials. If Canfield's pocketing that money and hiding dead children in unmarked graves, that's fraud. That's prosecutable. How do we prove it? Isaac asked. We dig up the graves, we count the bodies, we get a federal marshal, not one of Canfield's local deputies, to witness it. Mabel leaned forward. And we get testimonies from the students, written statements about what happened to them, names, dates, specific incidents. Ayoy felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. Canfield will never let us near that school again. He won't have a choice if we bring a federal marshal with enough authority to override him. Mabel pulled out another document from her satchel. This is a letter to Marshal James Henderson in Tucson. He's federal, he's honest, and he owes me a favor from way back. I'm going to ride to Tucson tomorrow and deliver it personally. It'll take me 4 days round trip. 4 days, Isaac said. We need to stay hidden for 4 days. Can you do it? Isaac looked at Ayoy. Ayoy looked at the children. Kaya was still trembling. Tahoma still hadn't made a sound. We'll do it, Ayoy said. We don't have another choice. Mabel stood up, wincing as her knees protested. Then you better get ready. Fairchild's going to be back soon, and when he comes, this place is going to be the first place they look. She looked at Isaac. You remember that ravine about 6 miles northeast? The one with the cave system? I remember. Take them there. It's hidden enough that they won't find you easily, and there's water from a spring. I'll bring supplies before I leave for Tucson. She paused. And Isaac, stay sober. I mean it. These children need you sharp. After Mabel left, Isaac began packing. He moved with military efficiency, gathering food blankets, canteens, ammunition. He wrapped everything in oilcloth to keep it dry and divided it into packs that even the children could carry. Ayoy watched him work and realized she was seeing a different version of the man. Not the haunted drinker who sat outside his cabin with nightmares. Not the gentle helper who splinted broken ankles. This was the soldier he'd been, the man who knew how to survive in hostile territory. We leave at sundown, he said, not looking up from his packing. It's cooler then and harder for them to track us. The ravine is rough going but defensible. If they find us there, we'll see them coming. What if they don't come alone? They won't. Canfield will send at least 10 men next time. Isaac finally looked up. But 10 men in a narrow ravine are worth about 3 men in open country. We'll have the advantage. You're talking about fighting them. I'm talking about defending you. There's a difference. Ayoy wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. This man had killed her brother. This man was now preparing to risk his life for her and 2 children he didn't know. The contradiction was too large to hold in her head without it splitting open. What changed in you? She asked. Between the man who killed my brother and the man packing supplies to save children. Isaac was quiet for a long time, his hands stilling on the pack he was tying. When he spoke, his voice was so low she almost didn't hear it. Because 17 years ago I followed orders without thinking. I killed people because someone told me they were enemies. I never asked if it was right, never questioned if it was necessary. I just pulled the trigger. He looked at her with those gray eyes that carried too much weight. Maybe your brother's death was necessary. Maybe those Apache families we hunted were actually dangerous. Maybe all the things we did were justified by something bigger than what I could see. But I don't believe that anymore. And if I don't do this, if I let them take you back to that school where children die in unmarked graves, then every person I killed died for nothing. Do you understand?" Ayoy did understand. It was the logic of a man trying to build something good on a foundation of corpses. It wouldn't work. Couldn't work. But she understood the desperate mathematics of it. "What if we can't stop them?" she asked. "Then we couldn't stop them. But at least we tried. At least we didn't just stand there and watch it happen." The sun was setting when they finally left the cabin. Isaac led the way, carrying the heaviest pack and his rifle. Ayoy followed with Kaya holding her hand. Tahoma walked behind them, silent as a shadow, his small pack making him look even smaller. They moved northeast through terrain that got rougher with every mile. Rocks the size of houses jutted from the earth at odd angles. Dry creek beds twisted through the landscape like scars. The temperature dropped as night came on, and Ayoy was grateful for the blanket Isaac had insisted she carry. Her ankle throbbed with every step, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. Behind her she could hear Kaya's labored breathing. The child was exhausted, running on nothing but fear and stubbornness. After 3 hours, Isaac stopped. They'd reached a narrow opening between two rock walls barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "This is it," he said. "The ravine entrance. It gets easier once we're inside." He wasn't lying. Beyond the narrow gap, the ravine opened into a canyon about 20 feet wide with walls that rose 50 feet on either side. The floor was sandy and relatively flat. In the darkness, Ayoy could hear water trickling somewhere close. Isaac led them deeper into the canyon until they reached a place where the wall had collapsed inward, creating a shallow cave. It wasn't deep, maybe 10 feet, but it would shelter them from wind and hide them from anyone looking down from above. "We'll camp here tonight," Isaac said. "No fire. It's too risky. But we've got blankets and it's warmer down here than out in the open." He helped them settle in, giving the children the driest spot, making sure they were wrapped warm. Then he took up position at the mouth of the cave, rifle across his knees, watching the darkness. Ayoy sat with the children until they fell asleep, then moved to sit near Isaac. Not next to him. Near him. "You should rest," he said without looking at her. "So should you." "I will. Later." They sat in silence for a while. The night sounds of the desert surrounded them, wind through stone, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of something small moving through brush. "Tell me about him," Isaac said finally. Ayoy didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Hastian. His name meant man, but he was gentle. Not weak. Just kind. He made flutes from bone and wood, taught me songs our mother had taught him. When the soldiers came, he tried to negotiate, tried to explain that we had permission from the Indian agent to be there. They didn't listen. Did you see it happen? I saw him fall. I was hiding with my mother. We watched him die from behind rocks 50 yards away." Her voice stayed steady through force of will alone. "She wouldn't let me go to him. Held me back. Said if I went, they'd shoot me too. So I watched my brother bleed out on ground that was supposed to be ours while he sang the death song our grandfather had taught him." Isaac's hands tightened on the rifle. "After the soldiers left, we went to him. He was still breathing barely. He told my mother to teach me to be strong, to teach me to remember. Then he died." Ayoy paused. "They took us to the school 3 months later, said we couldn't survive on our own, said they were saving us. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Sorry doesn't mean anything. Sorry is what white people say when they want to feel better about what they've done without actually changing anything." Isaac absorbed that without flinching. "You're right." They sat in silence again, longer this time. Finally, Ayoy spoke. "That flute in your cellar, the one I played last night, that was his. I recognized the way he carved the finger holes." "I know." "Did you take it from his body?" "Yes." "Why?" Isaac's voice, when he answered, was barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted to remember what it felt like to kill someone who was singing. I wanted to carry that weight. Thought maybe if I carried it long enough it would crush me and I could stop." "But you're still here." Yeah, turns out guilt doesn't kill you fast enough. Ayoy looked at his profile in the darkness, at the hard lines of his face, and the way he held himself like a man expecting a blow. If we survive this, she said, if we get those children somewhere safe and Canfield is stopped and the marshal actually does something, what will you do? I don't know. Will you keep drinking? Probably. Will you keep living in that cabin alone, waiting to die? Maybe. That's not a life. No, Isaac agreed. It's not. But it's what I deserve. Ayoy felt anger spike hot in her chest. You don't get to decide what you deserve. You don't get to wallow in your guilt and call it justice. My brother didn't die so you could spend 17 years feeling sorry for yourself. Isaac turned to look at her, his face catching the moonlight. Then what did he die for? I don't know yet, but it has to mean something more than this, more than you sitting in the dark waiting for permission to stop breathing. They stared at each other, and something passed between them that had no name. Not forgiveness, not friendship, something harder and more complicated. When this is over, Isaac said, when those children are safe, you can kill me if you want. I won't stop you. I know, but maybe I won't. Maybe I'll do something worse. What could be worse than death? Ayoy smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. I'll make you live, really live. Make you do something useful with whatever years you have left instead of wasting them on self-pity. That would be real justice, making you face every single day, knowing you can't undo what you did, but you have to try anyway. Isaac stared at her for a long moment. Then incredibly he laughed. It was a short, harsh sound, rusty from disuse. You're cruel, he said. I learned from the best, Ayoy replied. The Reverend taught me that the cruelest thing you can do to someone is force them to hope. 3 days passed in the ravine, and the desert heat during the day made the cave feel like an oven. Isaac rationed water carefully, giving the children more than they probably needed, but less than they wanted. He showed Ayoy how to wet cloth and drape it over their heads to stay cooler, showed her which rocks held shade longest. He was teaching her to survive, she realized, teaching her the way you'd teach someone you expected to outlive you. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Kaya developed a fever. It started as flushed cheeks and progressed quickly to burning skin and labored breathing. Ayoy pressed wet cloth to the child's forehead while Isaac checked her over with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen sickness before. It's not heat stroke, he said finally. There's infection somewhere. See this? He pointed to a cut on Kaya's arm that Ayoy hadn't noticed before, red and swollen. She must have gotten it during the escape. It's gone bad. What do we do? We need to clean it properly. I've got whiskey back at the cabin that would help, but that's a 4-hour round trip and I can't leave you here unprotected. Then I'll go. You can't walk 4 hours on that ankle. Watch me. They stared at each other, wills locked. I'll go, Isaac said, but I need you to stay alert. If anyone comes while I'm gone, you take Tahoma and you run deeper into the canyon. There are more caves back there. Hide and don't come out until you hear me call your name 3 times. Understand? Ayoy understood. She also understood that he was trusting her alone with the rifle, alone with knowledge of where the cave was, alone with every opportunity to disappear while he was gone. He handed her the weapon without hesitation. I'll be back before dark, he said. Then he was gone, moving up the canyon wall with surprising agility for a man his size. Ayoy settled in to wait, keeping the damp cloth on Kaya's forehead, watching the canyon entrance. Tahoma sat beside her, his small hand resting on Kaya's arm. He hadn't spoken, but his eyes said everything. Don't let her die. Please don't let her die. She'll be fine, Ayoy whispered. Another lie. The kindest kind. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky and shadows lengthened in the canyon. Kaya's fever climbed higher. She started mumbling in her sleep words in Apache that Ayoy had to lean close to hear. "Mama," Kaya whispered. "Mama, I'm cold." It was over 90 degrees in the cave. The fever was burning her from the inside out. Ayoy pressed more water to the child's lips, coaxing her to drink. Most of it ran down Kaya's chin, but some went in. Small victories. All they had. The sun was touching the western rim of the canyon when Ayoy heard movement. She grabbed the rifle, aimed at the canyon entrance, finger on the trigger. A figure appeared, backlit by the setting sun. Too tall to be Isaac. Wrong shape. Deputy Fairchild walked into view, hands raised, showing he was unarmed. "Don't shoot," he called. "I'm alone. I just want to talk." Ayoy kept the rifle trained on his chest. "How did you find us?" "Tracked Mercer. He's good at covering his trail, but not perfect." Fairchild took a step closer. "I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here to warn you." "Warn me about what?" "Canfield is bringing 20 men tomorrow. He's got approval from the territorial governor to use force if necessary. They're going to search every canyon, every cave, every rock formation within 20 miles. Fairchild's face was grim. "I've seen the order. It says to use any means necessary to secure the fugitives. That means if you resist, they're authorized to shoot." Ayoy's grip on the rifle tightened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've been thinking about what Mercer said, about the law, about what's legal versus what's right." Fairchild looked past her into the cave, saw Kaya lying fevered, saw Tahoma's huge, frightened eyes. "That little girl is dying. You know that? She has an infection." "She has more than that. I've seen that look before. Seen it on children at the school who don't make it." He paused. 7 died last year. Did you know that 7 children? Canfield reported 3 to the Bureau. The other 4 just disappeared from the records. Ayoy felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You knew about this?" "I suspected. Never had proof. Never looked too hard for proof because looking would mean having to do something about it." Fairchild's voice was heavy with something that might have been guilt. "But I'm looking now, and what I'm seeing makes me sick." "So what do you want from me?" "Testimony. Written testimony about what happened at that school. Names of children who died, dates if you remember them, descriptions of what was done to them." He pulled out a notebook and pencil from his pocket, set them on the ground, then stepped back. "You write it down. I'll take it to Marshal Henderson in Tucson myself, but you have to do it now before Canfield's men come tomorrow." Ayoy didn't lower the rifle. "This could be a trick." "Could be. But if it is, I'm the worst kind of person there is." Fairchild met her eyes. "I've got a daughter. She's 8. Every time I go to that school, every time I see those children and what's being done to them, I think, what if it was her? What if someone took my girl and locked her up and beat her for speaking English? Would I want someone to help her? Or would I want them to follow orders and look the other way?" The silence stretched between them. "Mercer's coming back soon," Fairchild said. "He'll probably try to shoot me. I'd appreciate it if you didn't let him. Tell him I'm here to help. Tell him I've had enough of following orders that make me hate myself." He turned and walked back down the canyon, disappearing around a bend in the rock. Ayoy stared after him for a long time, then looked down at the notebook on the ground. 7 children. 7 deaths hidden. 7 families who never knew what happened to their babies. She picked up the notebook and began to write. She was still writing when Isaac returned, climbing down the canyon wall with a pack on his back. He saw her with the notebook and froze. "What's that? Testimony?" Ayoy didn't look up, kept writing. "Deputy Fairchild was here. He wants us to document what happened at the school." Isaac dropped the pack and grabbed his rifle, scanning the canyon. "Where is he?" "Gone. He said he's taking this to Marshal Henderson himself." "And you believe him?" "I don't know. But Kaya is dying, and we're out of options, and maybe he's telling the truth." Ayoy finished writing and looked up. "He said Canfield is coming tomorrow with 20 men. He said they have authorization to use force." Isaac's face went still. "Then we need to move tonight, further into the canyon. There are places back there where 20 men won't matter. Or we could go to Tucson ourselves. Take the testimony directly to the marshal. That's 3 days' travel. Kaya won't last 3 days. Ayoy looked at the fevered child at Tahoma, sitting vigil beside her at Isaac, with his haunted eyes and steady hands. She looked at the notebook full of names and dates and descriptions of cruelty dressed up as salvation. "Then we split up," she said. "You take Kaya to a doctor in the closest town. I'll take Tahoma and this testimony to Tucson." "That's the worst plan I've ever heard. You have a better one." Isaac opened his pack and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, clean cloth, and a needle with thread. "I save the girl first. Then we worry about the rest." He worked on Kaya's arm for an hour, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made the child scream, then stitching it closed with careful, practiced movements. Ayoy held Kaya down, while Tahoma watched with huge, terrified eyes. When it was done, Isaac wrapped the arm in clean cloth and forced Kaya to drink water mixed with willow bark he'd brought from the cabin. "She needs real medicine," he said quietly, "but this might be enough to keep her alive until we can get to a doctor." "How long before we know?" "If the fever breaks by morning, she'll probably make it. If it doesn't—" He didn't finish the sentence. They settled in for another night. Isaac took first watch while Ayoy tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay there listening to Kaya's labored breathing, to Tahoma's soft crying that he tried to hide to Isaac's quiet movements as he cleaned his rifle for the 10th time. Finally she gave up and moved to sit beside him again. "Tell me about the boy," she said. Isaac's hands stilled on the rifle. "What boy?" "The one whose initials are on that box in your cabin. HM 1880. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set the rifle aside and spoke. "Henry Mercer. My son. He was 10 when he died." Ayoy felt her breath catch. "I didn't know you had a child." "Most people don't. He died 6 years ago. Fever. Same kind that's taking Kaya now." Isaac's voice was flat emotionless, the way people spoke about pain too big to feel. "His mother, my wife, Margaret, she died 3 months later. Different fever, or maybe the same one. I don't know. By then I was too drunk to notice the difference." "Is that when you started carrying the Apache items after he died?" "No. I started carrying them during the war. But after Henry died, I understood why." He looked at her. "You want to know something terrible?" Ayoy nodded. "The day Henry died, he was playing with a flute. A little bone flute he'd made himself. Someone had taught him how, though Margaret could never remember who. He died with that flute in his hand, and all I could think about was the Apache boy I'd shot who'd been carrying a flute just like it." Isaac's voice cracked. "I kept thinking someone loved that boy the way I loved Henry. Someone taught him to make music. Someone held him when he was sick. And I killed him while he was singing." Understanding crashed over Ayoy like cold water. The boy with the flute. That was Hastian. Maybe. Probably. I don't know for certain, but the timing matches, and I killed more than one boy with a flute. He pulled out a piece of cloth from his pocket, unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small flute, crude but functional. "This is Henry's, the one he made. I keep it with your brother's because I wanted to remember that every person I killed was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's Henry." Ayoy took the flute with shaking hands. It was rough work, the holes uneven, made by a child who was still learning. She held it next to the memory of Hastian's flute, the one she'd played 3 nights ago, and saw the similarity. The same style, the same basic construction. "Your son learned from an Apache," she said softly. "Somehow, somewhere, a native person taught Henry how to make music." "I know. That's what makes it worse. Henry learned something beautiful from the very people I was killing. And he never knew his father was a murderer." They sat with that truth between them, heavy as stone. Finally, Ayoy spoke. "I'm not going to kill you." Isaac looked at her, surprised. "Not because you don't deserve it. You probably do. But because killing you wouldn't bring Hastian back, wouldn't save Kaya, wouldn't help any of those children in unmarked graves." She paused. "My brother taught me that revenge is a fire that burns the person holding it. I won't let you turn me into something burned." Then what do you want from me? I want you to live. Really live. Stop drinking. Stop hiding. Help me make sure no more children end up in those graves. She looked at him steadily. That's my revenge, making you face every single day and do better than you did yesterday, making you build instead of destroy. That's what Hastian would have wanted. That's what Henry would have wanted. Isaac's face crumpled. For a moment Ayoy thought he might cry, but he pulled himself together with visible effort and nodded. I can try. Trying is all anyone can do. They were still sitting there, two people bound together by blood and guilt and the desperate hope that something good could be built from something terrible, when Kaya's fever broke. The child opened her eyes as dawn light filtered into the canyon, looked at Ayoy with clear recognition, and whispered, "Water." Ayoy gave her water, gave her food, held her while she cried from relief and pain and the simple fact of still being alive. Tahoma, silent for so long, made a sound. Not words, just a small noise of joy that might have been the first sound he'd made in years. Isaac watched them, and something in his face changed, softened. For the first time since Ayoy had met him, he looked like he might actually believe that hope was something other than a lie people told themselves. "We should move," he said finally. "Canfield's men will be here today. We need to be deeper in the canyon before they arrive." They packed quickly, Ayoy carrying Kaya, Isaac carrying the packs, and Tahoma. They moved further into the labyrinth of stone, finding places where the walls narrowed to gaps barely wide enough to squeeze through, where a dozen men would have to come single file and blind. By noon they were 3 miles into the canyon system, in a place where sound echoed strangely, and the light turned the rocks red as blood. They found another cave deeper than the first, with ancient markings on the walls that Ayoy recognized as Apache symbols. "We're on old ground," she said, touching the carved spirals and lines. "My people have been here before. This is sacred space." Isaac looked at the markings with something like reverence. "Then maybe we'll be safe here. Maybe the land will protect you." "Land doesn't protect anyone. People do." "Then I'll protect you." He said it simply, a statement of fact rather than a promise. "Until the marshal comes. Until Canfield is stopped. Until you're free to go wherever you want. I'll stand between you and anyone who tries to take that freedom away." Ayoy believed him. And that belief felt like its own kind of danger, because believing in a man who'd killed her brother meant rearranging everything she thought she knew about justice and mercy and what it meant to be human. They settled into the deep cave and waited for either salvation or destruction to find them. Neither one was sure which would arrive first. The marshal arrived before Canfield did. Isaac heard the single horse approaching just after dawn on the 4th day, and he moved to the cave entrance with his rifle ready. But the man who appeared at the narrow gap in the rocks wore a different kind of badge, silver instead of brass, and he held his hands away from his weapons as he approached. "Isaac Mercer," the man called. "I'm Federal Marshal James Henderson. Mabel Thornton sent me. I'm here to help." Isaac studied him from behind cover. Henderson was perhaps 50, with gray hair and a weathered face that suggested he'd spent most of those years outdoors. He wore his authority like old clothes, comfortable but not showy. "How do I know you're who you say you are?" Henderson slowly reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "Mabel said you'd be suspicious. She told me to show you this." He tossed the paper toward the cave. It landed 10 feet away. Isaac moved out, grabbed it, moved back before Henderson could do anything. The paper was a letter in Mabel's handwriting. It said, "Isaac, this man is legitimate. I've known him 30 years. Trust him like you trust me, which I know isn't much, but it's all we've got. The children need help now. Let him in. Mabel." At the bottom she'd added, "P.S. He knows about Henry. I told him. I'm sorry, but he needed to understand why you'd risk everything for Apache children." Isaac's hands tightened on the letter, but he lowered his rifle. "Come in. Slowly." Henderson moved through the gap, keeping his hands visible, and stopped when he saw Ayoy and the children. His face went carefully neutral, the expression of a lawman who'd seen too much to be shocked by anything. "Miss," he said, nodding to Ayoy. Then to the children, "You're safe now. I'm here to make sure you stay that way." "Empty words," Ayoy said. "Men with badges have said that before." "I expect they have, and I expect they were lying." Henderson pulled out a canteen and held it out. "I'm not lying. Mabel showed me testimony about St. Catherine's, showed me the notebook Deputy Fairchild brought her. 7 children dead, maybe more. That's federal jurisdiction, and I take that kind of corruption seriously." Ayoy looked at Isaac. Isaac gave a small nod. She took the canteen. Henderson sat down on a rock, moving slowly like a man approaching spooked horses. "Here's the situation. Reverend Canfield has 20 men on the way here. They've got territorial authorization, which means they think they're legal. But that authorization doesn't override federal law, and I've got documents that say these children are under federal investigation as witnesses. That makes them untouchable." "Canfield won't care about documents," Isaac said. "Probably not. But the men with him will. Most of them are just following orders. They're not going to risk federal prosecution for a reverend, no matter how connected he is." Henderson leaned forward. "I need you to come with me. All of you. We ride to the school, we confront Canfield in front of his men, and we force him to back down publicly." "That's suicide," Isaac said flatly. "It's leverage. Right now, Canfield controls the narrative. He says these children are dangerous runaways who need to be returned for their own good. We change that narrative. We show his men what he's really running. We show them the graves." Ayoy felt her stomach drop. "You want to dig up the children? I want to document them, count them, match them against school records." Henderson's face was grim. "It's ugly work. It's necessary work. And it's the only way to make sure this doesn't happen again." Kaya, still weak from her fever, pressed closer to Ayoy. Tahoma watched Henderson with dark, evaluating eyes. "What if Canfield's men don't back down?" Ayoy asked. "What if they decide a federal marshal is less important than keeping their secrets? Then I arrest them. And if they resist arrest, I deal with that too." Henderson touched the gun at his hip. "I didn't ride 4 days through desert heat to watch children die. One way or another, this ends today." Isaac and Ayoy looked at each other. Whole conversations passed in that glance. Risk versus safety, action versus hiding, the possibility of justice against the certainty of danger. "If we do this," Isaac said slowly, "and it goes wrong, those children don't survive. You understand that?" "I do. I also understand that if we don't do this, more children die. Different children, but just as dead." Henderson stood up. "I've got 3 deputies waiting at a camp 2 miles south. We can be at the school by noon. Canfield's men won't arrive until afternoon at the earliest. That gives us time to document everything before they get there." "And then what?" Ayoy asked. "Then we show them the truth, and we see which matters more, following orders or following conscience." The ride to St. Catherine's Industrial School took 3 hours. Henderson had brought extra horses, and they moved at a steady pace across terrain that Ayoy knew by heart. Every rock, every twisted tree, every shadow brought back memories of the 7 years she'd spent as property of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Kaya rode with Ayoy, still too weak to sit alone. Tahoma rode with Isaac, his small arms wrapped around the man's waist, trusting in a way that made Ayoy's chest ache. Henderson's 3 deputies met them at the arranged spot. They were younger men, hard-faced and professional, who looked at the children with expressions that ranged from pity to anger. One of them, a Mexican man named Cortez, spat when Henderson explained what they were about to do. "I knew Canfield was dirty," Cortez said, "but hiding dead children, that's evil." "That's why we're here," Henderson replied, "to make sure evil has consequences." The school appeared on the horizon just before noon. It looked exactly as Ayoy remembered, a cluster of brown buildings arranged around a central yard, surrounded by a fence that was supposed to keep threats out but really kept children in. She could see students in the yard, 40 or 50 of them lined up in rows for some kind of inspection or drill. Sister Judith stood on the porch of the main building, her habit spotless despite the dust, her face sharp as broken glass. Henderson rode straight up to the gate and dismounted. "Federal Marshal James Henderson, I'm here to speak with Reverend Canfield." Sister Judith's eyes narrowed. "The Reverend is preparing for a necessary expedition. He cannot be disturbed." Then I'll disturb him anyway. This is federal business." Henderson walked past her without waiting for permission, and his deputies followed. Ayoy stayed on her horse, suddenly paralyzed. Being this close to the school again made her skin crawl. Every instinct screamed to run to get as far away as possible before they dragged her back inside and locked her in the isolation room where the darkness never ended. Isaac moved his horse closer to hers. "You don't have to go in." "Yes, I do." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Those children in the yard, they need to see that someone came back, someone who got away and survived." She dismounted, helped Kaya down, and walked through the gate she'd escaped 4 days ago. The children in the yard saw her immediately. A ripple went through the ranks, whispers spreading like wind through grass. She saw faces she knew: Mary, 12 years old, who'd had her fingers broken for writing in Apache; Joseph, 8, who'd been whipped for crying when they cut his hair; Sarah, 14, who'd tried to run away twice and been brought back in chains. They stared at Ayoy like she was a ghost. Sister Judith's voice cracked across the yard. "Students, eyes forward. Do not acknowledge that girl. She is a fugitive and a shame to this institution." Not one child looked away from Ayoy. "I said eyes forward." Sister Judith's face was red now. "Anyone who disobeys will spend the night in isolation." Ayoy walked forward, limping on her still healing ankle, until she stood in the center of the yard. She looked at each child, meeting their eyes, seeing the hope and fear and desperate need for someone to tell them it was going to be okay. "My name is Ayoy," she said in Apache, loud enough for everyone to hear. Sister Judith gasped. "You will not speak that savage language on school grounds." "My name is Ayoy," she repeated, still in Apache. "I escaped 4 days ago with 2 children. We survived. We are free. And I came back to tell you that there are people who will help, people who will fight for you." The door to the main building slammed open, and Reverend Canfield emerged. He looked older than Ayoy remembered, his face drawn and pale, but his eyes were the same, cold, certain, convinced of his own righteousness. "Marshal Henderson," he said, ignoring Ayoy completely. "This is an unwelcome surprise. I'm about to depart on official business." "I know. You're planning to hunt down 3 children with 20 armed men." Henderson stood his ground. "I'm here to tell you that won't be happening. Those children are wards of this institution. They must be returned. Those children are witnesses in a federal investigation. They're under my protection now." Henderson pulled out a document and held it up. "I have authorization from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to investigate this school for financial irregularities and potential violations of the Indian Schools Act." Canfield's face went very still. "What investigation?" "The one about the 7 children who died here last year. The ones you didn't report. The ones buried in unmarked graves behind the school." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop. Canfield recovered quickly, his expression smoothing into practiced concern. "Marshal, I understand there may have been some confusion, but I assure you every death at this institution has been properly documented and reported. We maintain meticulous records." "Then you won't mind showing me those records, and you won't mind showing me the graves." "The cemetery is private property. You need a warrant." "I have one." Henderson pulled out another paper. "Signed by a federal judge 2 days ago. It gives me authority to search school property, examine records, and interview students." He paused. "It also suspends your authority pending the outcome of this investigation." Canfield's mask slipped. Just for a moment Ayoy saw beneath it to the fury and fear that lived there, then it snapped back into place. "This is outrageous. I'll be contacting the territorial governor." "You do that. In the meantime, I'll be examining those graves." Henderson turned to his deputies. "Cortez Martinez, you're with me. Sullivan, you stay here with Mr. Mercer and keep the children safe." They walked toward the back of the school, leaving Canfield standing on the porch with Sister Judith beside him. Ayoy watched them go, then turned back to the students in the yard. "Who wants to tell the truth?" she asked in Apache. 40 hands went up. The graves were behind the school in a plot of land that wasn't quite hidden but wasn't advertised either. There were no headstones, no markers, just disturbed earth in rough rectangles. Henderson counted 12 mounds. 12, not 7. He turned to Canfield, who had followed, despite not being invited. "You said 7 deaths. I count 12 graves. Some of those are older, from before my time. Then let's check the records." Henderson nodded to Cortez, who'd brought the school's official ledger from the office. "According to this, you've reported 3 deaths in the last 2 years. Clara Martinez died of pneumonia, Robert Blackhorse died of influenza, and Samuel Red Cloud died in an accident." "That's correct. So who's in the other 9 graves?" Canfield said nothing. Henderson knelt beside the nearest mound and began to dig with his bare hands. The earth was loose, recently turned. Within minutes he'd uncovered something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a child, maybe 8 years old, body preserved by the dry desert air. The cause of death was obvious. A skull fractured so badly the bone had caved inward. Henderson stood up slowly. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. "Reverend Canfield, you're under arrest for murder conspiracy to commit murder fraud and violation of federal trust." "That child fell," Canfield said. His voice had gone thin. "It was an accident. We'll let a jury decide that." Henderson looked at his deputies. "Dig up the rest. Document everything. I want photographs, measurements, and a full accounting." They worked for hours. Ayoy watched from the schoolyard, surrounded by students who'd left their orderly ranks to cluster around her and Isaac and the 2 younger children. Sister Judith had tried to restore order, but the children ignored her. For the first time in years, they weren't afraid. By the time the sun started to sink toward the horizon, Henderson's deputies had uncovered 9 more bodies. 9 children aged between 6 and 14 dead from injuries that ranged from beatings to starvation to what looked like deliberate poisoning. The students watched in silence. Some cried, some looked away, but they all bore witness. When Deputy Fairchild arrived with Canfield's 20 men just before sunset, he found a very different scene than expected. The Reverend was in chains. His men were documenting atrocities, and the children he'd come to retrieve were surrounded by 40 other students who'd formed a human wall around them. Fairchild dismounted slowly, looking at the graves at Canfield, at Henderson's grim face. "Marshal," he said quietly, "I brought the testimony." "I see it." Henderson gestured to the bodies. "Thank you for that. It led us here." Fairchild looked at the men behind him, the 20 who'd come to hunt children, and raised his voice. "You all seeing this? You all seeing what we were about to fight for?" Silence. Then one man, the town blacksmith, turned his horse around and rode away. Then another. Then 5 more. By the time full dark fell, Canfield had 10 men left. Henderson had 40 students, 3 deputies, 1 former soldier, and a federal warrant. It wasn't even close to a fair fight. The trial took 3 weeks. It was held in Tucson in a courtroom packed with people who'd heard about the dead children and wanted to see justice done. The prosecution called 40 witnesses, students from the school, former teachers who'd been silenced, and Ayoy, who stood in front of the judge and jury and told the truth in clear, unbreakable English. She described the beatings, the starvation rations, the isolation rooms, the systematic destruction of language and culture and identity. She described watching her friend Rebecca die after Sister Judith pushed her down the stairs. She described the girl named Clara, who'd been locked in a closet for a week and emerged unable to speak. She described the boy named Samuel, who'd been beaten so badly he coughed blood for days before he died. The defense attorney, a smooth-faced man from Phoenix, tried to discredit her. "Isn't it true, Miss— what did you say your name was?" "Ayoy. Isn't it true that you're a fugitive, that you escaped from legal custody?" "I escaped from prison. They called it a school, but it was prison. You were there to be educated, to be saved from a savage life." Ayoy looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "The only thing I needed to be saved from was people like you. People who think my language is savage, my culture is wrong, and my existence needs to be fixed." She paused. "My brother was killed by soldiers who thought the same thing. He was singing when he died." "Was that savage? Or was that human?" The courtroom was silent. The defense attorney changed tactics. "You've been staying with Isaac Mercer, correct? A former soldier who admittedly killed Apache people during the conflicts." "Yes." "Isn't that convenient? A man with blood on his hands harboring Apache fugitives? Perhaps this is all an elaborate scheme to avoid prosecution for his own crimes." Isaac stood up from where he'd been sitting in the back. "I'll answer that." The judge looked surprised but nodded. "Mr. Mercer, you're not on trial here." "Maybe I should be." Isaac walked to the front of the courtroom. "Everything that lawyer just said is true. I killed Apache people, maybe including this girl's brother. I followed orders without thinking about whether they were right. I did terrible things, and I've spent 17 years trying to drown the memory of them." The defense attorney smiled, thinking he'd won. Isaac turned to face the jury. "But here's what I learned. You can't drown guilt. You can't hide from it. The only thing you can do is face it and try to do better. That's why I helped these children, not to avoid prosecution, not to make myself feel better, but because for the first time in 17 years I had a chance to do something right instead of something legal." He looked at Ayoy. "This girl should hate me. She has every right to hate me. But instead she made me a deal, help save the children, and she wouldn't kill me. That deal saved my life. Not because she spared me, but because it gave me a reason to keep living, a purpose bigger than my guilt." He turned back to the jury. "So yes, I have blood on my hands. Yes, I should probably be in prison. But if locking me up means men like Canfield keep running schools where children die, then your justice isn't worth a damn." The judge banged his gavel. "Mr. Mercer, that's enough." "No, it's not. It's not nearly enough. But it's all I've got." He walked back to his seat. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The prosecution called their final witness, Mabel Thornton, who testified about the children she'd helped bury, the records she'd kept secretly, and the decades of abuse she'd witnessed and been powerless to stop. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" the defense attorney asked. "Because I was a coward," Mabel said simply. "I told myself I was too old, too unimportant, that no one would listen. But the real reason was fear. Fear of men like Canfield who hide behind God and law and righteousness while they destroy children." She looked at the jury. "I'm not afraid anymore. And neither are these children. That should tell you something." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Canfield guilty on all counts: 12 counts of murder, 40 counts of assault, numerous counts of fraud and embezzlement. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. Sister Judith was convicted of being an accessory and received 15 years. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was ordered to conduct a full investigation of all Indian boarding schools in the territory, and St. Catherine's Industrial School was shut down permanently. When the verdict was read, Ayoy felt something inside her chest that she couldn't name. Not quite relief, not quite victory. Something more complicated, the beginning of healing maybe, or the end of a long, terrible chapter. She looked at Isaac, who sat with his head bowed, and wondered if he felt the same thing. After the trial, Henderson approached Ayoy and Isaac as they were leaving the courthouse. "I need to speak with you both, privately." They followed him to a small office where Mabel was already waiting. She looked exhausted but satisfied, like a woman who'd finally put down a weight she'd been carrying too long. "The Bureau wants to know what to do with the children," Henderson said without preamble. "St. Catherine's is closed, but there are 40 students who need somewhere to go. Some have families they can return to, but many don't. The Bureau is talking about transferring them to other schools." "No," Ayoy's voice was flat. "Those other schools will be the same. Different buildings, same cruelty." "I agree. That's why I'm asking, do you have another option?" Ayoy looked at Isaac. Isaac looked at Mabel. Mabel smiled. "We might," the old woman said. "Isaac's got 40 acres. I've got 60. Between us, that's enough land to build something. Not a school, something different." "What kind of something?" Henderson asked. "A place where children can learn their own language." Ayoy said the idea forming as she spoke. "Where they can remember who they are instead of being forced to forget. Where they're safe." You're talking about founding a school of your own. I'm talking about founding a home. Ayoy leaned forward. Apache children shouldn't have to choose between education and identity. They shouldn't have to give up their language to learn English or forget their culture to understand math. There should be a place where both exist together. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. The Bureau will never approve that officially. Indian education policy is assimilation. It's been that way for 30 years. Then we do it unofficially, Mabel said. We register it as a private homestead. Children who want to come can come. Those who want to leave can leave. No fences, no locks. No one forcing them to be anything other than who they are. You're talking about going against federal policy. I'm talking about following human decency. Mabel looked at him steadily. You going to arrest us for that, Marshal? Henderson smiled. It was a tired smile, but genuine. Not today. Maybe not ever. He pulled out some papers from his desk. These are land grant documents. They'll give you legal claim to both properties as a single parcel. There's also a fund about $3,000 that was recovered from Canfield's embezzlement. The Bureau owes it as restitution to the families of the children who died. I can't think of a better use than starting this home of yours. Ayoy took the papers with shaking hands. Why are you helping us? Because I'm tired of enforcing laws that create injustice. Because those children deserve better. Because... He paused. Because my grandmother was Cherokee. She survived the Trail of Tears when she was 8 years old. She never talked about it, but I remember her crying in her sleep, sometimes speaking words I didn't understand. She died when I was 12 and I never knew her real name. They'd taken it from her. He stood up. Build your school. Teach those children their language. Give them back what was stolen. And if anyone tries to stop you, you send word to me. I'll make sure they regret it. The land Isaac and Mabel owned was in a valley between red rock mesas, protected from the worst of the desert wind, but still open to the sky. There was water from 2 springs, enough flat ground to build on, and shade from cottonwood trees that had been growing there for 100 years. They spent 6 months building. Isaac did most of the construction work, teaching Ayoy and the older students as he went. Mabel organized supplies and managed relations with the few nearby homesteaders. Deputy Fairchild, who'd resigned from his position after the trial, helped with the heavy labor. By the end of that time, they had 4 cabins, a large common building, and a garden that was actually producing food. 40 students came. Some from families who'd heard about the place and brought their children themselves. Some who had nowhere else to go. Some who'd run away from other schools and found their way to what people were starting to call Hastian's house, though Ayoy had never officially named it that. The name had come from the students themselves, who'd heard the story about her brother and decided that a place of learning should honor someone who'd died for refusing to forget who he was. Ayoy taught language and history. Mabel taught reading and writing and arithmetic. Isaac taught practical skills, building farming survival. Fairchild taught law and citizenship, making sure the students understood their rights in a country that didn't always recognize them. Fairchild never wore a badge again. 3 years after the trial, he married a widow from a nearby settlement who'd lost her husband to fever. They had no children of their own, but every summer they brought his stepdaughter, a quiet girl named Rose, to study at Hastian's house. The girl learned to read in both English and Apache, and when she turned 18, she became the first graduate to return as a teacher. Fairchild died at 52, thrown from a horse while checking fence lines. At his funeral, 20 former students came to stand witness. Ayoy spoke. This man spent the first half of his life following bad orders. He spent the second half teaching children how to question them. That's redemption. And slowly, painfully, something new began to grow in the desert. In the 10th year after the trial, Hastian's house faced its greatest test. A new Bureau agent arrived from Washington, armed with revised assimilation policies and a mandate to bring all irregular schools under federal control. He was a young man, barely 30, with a degree from Harvard and a certainty that science had proven the inferiority of native cultures. He stood in the common building and told Ayoy, "This experiment is over. These children will be transferred to proper institutions where they can receive proper education. Ayoy looked at him with eyes that had seen men like him before. Show me your warrant. I don't need a warrant. I have federal authority. Then I'll show you mine. She handed him a document signed by Marshal Henderson before his retirement, a federal protection order declaring Hastings House a recognized cultural preservation site under the Antiquities Act. It wasn't exactly legal. It wasn't exactly illegal. It was exactly enough. The agent left threatening appeals. Those appeals died in bureaucratic limbo, lost in paperwork that Henderson's old friends made sure stayed lost. That year they built a new wing and named it Henderson Hall. The Marshal, 78 and barely able to ride anymore, attended the dedication. He looked at the 80 children singing in 3 languages and said to Ayoy, "Your brother would have been proud." "He would have been alive," Ayoy replied. "That would have been better." "Yes, but since he's not, this is what matters." Henderson touched the wall of the new building. "This is what survives." It was 2 years after that moment, 12 years after the trial, when Ayoy finally took Isaac to Hastings' grave. They rode out at dawn, just the 2 of them, to a place about 10 miles from the school where her family had been living when the soldiers came. She'd been back once before alone, but this time she wanted Isaac with her. The grave was marked with stones arranged in the Apache way, and someone, probably her mother before she died, had planted sage around it. Ayoy dismounted and stood looking at the stones for a long time. Isaac stayed on his horse waiting. "You can come closer," she said finally. Isaac got down and walked over, stopping a few feet away. He held something wrapped in cloth. "I brought Henry's flute," he said quietly. "And Hastings. I don't know what I thought. Maybe that they should be together." Ayoy looked at him. "You think they knew each other?" "I don't know. But maybe in some way they were the same. 2 boys who made music. 2 boys who died because of men like me." He unwrapped the flutes and laid them both at the base of the grave marker. "I can't give you back your brother. I can't undo what I did. But I can give him this, and I can spend the rest of my life teaching children what I tried to destroy." Ayoy knelt beside the grave and pulled out a small clay pot from her saddlebag. "This is honey, mixed with pollen and water. It's an Apache ritual for the dead. It says the bitter has passed, now comes the sweet." She poured the honey over the stones, watching it run into the cracks and crevices, golden in the morning light. Then she sang her voice clear and strong, the song her brother had been singing when he died. Isaac listened, and when she was finished he spoke in halting Apache. The words were clumsy, his accent terrible, but he'd been learning from Ayoy for 2 years, and he got the meaning across. "I'm sorry. I will do better. I will remember." Ayoy stood up and looked at this man who'd killed her brother and saved her life, who'd been the worst thing that ever happened to her family and the best thing that could have happened to 40 lost children. "I forgive you," she said. Isaac's face crumpled. "I don't deserve that. No one deserves forgiveness. That's why it's called grace." She put her hand on his arm. "You're not the man who killed my brother anymore. You're the man who built Hastings House. You're the man who teaches children that their language matters. You're the man who chose to face his guilt instead of drowning in it. I still see their faces, the people I killed. I still hear them. You'll always hear them. That's the price of what you did. But you don't have to let that be the only thing you hear." She squeezed his arm. "Come on. We've got students waiting, and Mabel said she'd make that bread you like if we got back before noon." They rode back together, 2 people bound by blood and forgiveness and the hard work of building something better than what had been destroyed. When they crested the final ridge and saw Hastings House below, the common building was full of children. Ayoy could hear them from half a mile away, their voices raised in song. Apache songs, English songs, and some hybrid of both that they were creating themselves. "Listen to that," Isaac said softly. "I am. That's what we did. You and me and Mabel and everyone else. We made that sound possible. No, Ayoy corrected. Those children made it possible. We just gave them the space to sing. They rode down the slope toward home. 5 years later, Hastian's house had grown to accommodate 80 students. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had tried twice to shut it down, and failed both times mostly because Marshal Henderson kept finding procedural reasons why their orders weren't valid. The newspapers called it the Apache experiment. Some praised it, most condemned it, but the families kept bringing their children, and the children kept learning, and the songs kept being sung. Ayoy, now 24, had become the unofficial head teacher. She'd learned to read and write with the fluency that came from daily practice, and she used those skills to document everything: student records, curricula, letters to families, appeals to the Bureau. She wrote constantly, creating a paper trail that made the school harder to erase. Isaac, 42 now and mostly sober, had expanded the buildings 3 times. The last addition was a dedicated music room where students learned to make traditional instruments. The walls were covered with flutes, drums, and other instruments that students had crafted themselves. On the wall of that room, mounted in a place of honor, were 2 flutes in a glass case, Henry's and Hastian's side by side. Below them was a plaque that read, "These boys never met, but their songs live on in the children who learn here." Mabel, now 79 and showing it, had retired from active teaching, but still managed the school's finances with an iron hand. She sat on the porch most days watching the children play, and occasionally telling stories about Ireland and Magdalen laundries, and what it meant to survive things that should have killed you. Kaya, now 16, had become Ayoy's assistant teacher. She'd found her voice again and used it constantly, teaching younger students with a patience that came from remembering what it felt like to be small and scared. Tahoma, 14, still didn't speak much, but he played the flute beautifully, and sometimes his music said more than words ever could. On a morning in late spring, when the desert had bloomed with wildflowers that would die by summer, Ayoy stood at the entrance to Hastian's house and watched new students arrive. 3 children, siblings whose parents had died and who had nowhere else to go. They looked terrified. Of course they did. Every new student looked terrified at first. Ayoy walked out to meet them, limping slightly on an ankle that had never quite healed right, and knelt down so she was eye level with the youngest. "What's your name?" she asked in Apache. The child whispered something too quiet to hear. "It's okay," Ayoy said. "You don't have to tell me yet, but when you're ready, we'll listen. That's what we do here. We listen. We remember. We learn." She stood up and held out her hand. "Come on, let's find you something to eat." The child took her hand. Behind them, Isaac was already building another cabin, because there would always be more children who needed a place where they could be themselves without apology, where they could speak their language without punishment, where they could learn that survival wasn't the same as forgetting. Ayoy looked at the land that had become her home, at the children who had become her family, at the man who had killed her brother, and then spent years trying to make that death mean something other than loss. It wasn't perfect. Nothing built by broken people ever was. But it was real. It was growing. And every day it proved that the worst things that happened to you didn't have to define what happened next. The sun rose higher. The children sang. The flutes played. And in the desert where so much had died, something new continued to live. The end came quietly, as most real endings do. 20 years after the trial, on a cool morning in October, Isaac Mercer died in his sleep at the age of 62. His heart, which had carried too much weight for too many years, simply stopped. They buried him on the property under a cottonwood tree he'd planted when they first started building. Ayoy spoke at the funeral, her voice steady. "This man killed my brother. That's true. That will always be true. But it's not the only truth. He also saved my life. He built this place. He taught hundreds of children that they were worthy of respect and dignity and love." She paused. "He couldn't undo what he'd done. But he spent 23 years doing better. That counts for something. That has to count for something." They buried him with Henry's photograph in his pocket and a flute carved by one of his students laid on his chest. 3 years later, Mabel followed. She was 82, sharp-minded to the end, and she died telling a story to a group of students about a girl in Ireland who'd survived hell and come out the other side still believing in human goodness. They buried her next to Isaac because she'd said that's where she wanted to be. "That fool and I started this thing together," she'd told Ayoy. "Might as well finish together too." Sister Judith served her full sentence and was released at 60 years old. She returned to Ireland, entering a Carmelite convent where she took a vow of silence. She wrote one letter to Ayoy before she died 8 years after her release. The letter said only, "I see now what I could not see then. The children were not broken. We were. I ask nothing of you. I only wanted you to know I finally understand." Ayoy kept the letter in a wooden box beside Hastian's flute. She never replied. Some wounds she'd learned were meant to scar, not heal. Ayoy lived to be 63, long enough to see Hastian's house survive her to become an institution that the Bureau of Indian Affairs grudgingly accepted because it was cheaper than fighting it. Long enough to see some of her former students become teachers themselves, spreading out across the territory and starting their own schools. Long enough to see Kaya, now 50 years old, take over as head of the school. On her last day, Ayoy asked Kaya to take her to Hastian's grave. They rode out together, moving slowly, because Ayoy's body had worn out the way bodies do. She stood at the grave, older now than her brother would ever be, and poured one more pot of honey over the stones. "I did it," she said to him. "I kept our language alive. I made sure the children remembered. I built something that outlasted the people who tried to destroy us." She touched the stones. "You can rest now. We all can." Kaya helped her back onto the horse and they rode home. Ayoy died that night in her sleep in a bed in a house she'd built with her own hands, surrounded by children who knew her name and could sing the songs her brother had died singing. They buried her between Isaac and Mabel, 3 people who'd started with blood and guilt and fear and built something that lasted. On her grave marker they carved 3 words in Apache and English, still standing here. And they were. All of them. In the children who sang. In the schools that followed. In the language that survived. In the hard-won knowledge that the worst things that happened to you didn't have to be the last things. The desert remembered. The honey healed. And the songs continued. Because that's what it means to survive. Not to forget, not to forgive easily, but to transform pain into purpose, and death into legacy, and silence into song. That's what Ayoy did. That's what they all did. And long after their bones returned to the red earth that had made them their work continued in the voices of children who knew their names and refused to forget. The end.